Hello, everyone, and good evening. I would like to say a warm welcome on behalf of Columbia Global Centers Istanbul. This is our first webinar, and we're delighted to be here with Tayfun Bayazıt, Chairman of Bayazıt Consulting Services. Tayfun is not someone not known to most of you. So I just wanted to start by saying that it's a time of great anxiety, both for the world and for Turkey in terms of our health, in terms of our financial futures. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome again Tayfun, a close friend of Columbia Global Centers Advisory Board member, having had his MBA also from Columbia University. Welcome, Tayfun, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Okay, we're going to do a format of about half an hour of Tayfun presenting with some questions from me, and then we're going to also open it up for questions after that half hour. We've already received a couple of questions over email from you, and thank you for that, but you can also send in more questions through the chat box. Okay, well, then let's get going. You know, you've had a vast domestic and international banking experience, and you're now mostly involved in corporate boards and consulting business. How would you evaluate the global preparedness for this pandemic? I mean, I want to ask this from both a national level, a corporation level, other institutional levels. Did these institutions, did the leaders of countries, did they miss something big? Why and what? Thank you.
Thank you, Ipek. That's a very, timely question. I think, first of all, this is unfortunately a big tragedy that we are going through. I mean, pandemics is something that we have not experienced in our lifetimes. We have heard about it, the previous pandemics, etc. But the one that we are going through now is having a significant impact on our lives, on the economies. Unfortunately, to your question, they seem to have missed it big time. And the lack of global coordination and understanding seems to have made things much worse. It is a pandemic that is touching our lives, economies today. As I said, we have not seen anything like this in our lives. Aside from GDP or the economy, our lives are changing and will change. And once we go back to normal, whatever that new normal is, we will see a significant damage in the economies that needs to be repaired. So it will also have an enormous impact on the future, not only economically, but the way that we live, the way that we travel, the way that we do business, etc. So when it comes to preparedness issue, although there have been a few pre-warnings, I'm sure most of us had watched what Bill Gates said 5 years ago. After 5 years, we paid most attention to it, and a couple of other pre-warnings. Unfortunately, little had been done on the pandemic risk, both at the national levels and the company levels. Every year, Marsh McLennan, jointly with Zurich Insurance, prepares a global risk report, which is basically a questionnaire shared with about 1,000 companies, corporations, and this report in detail shows what are the risks that are perceived by companies and what sort of importance they attach to it. And this is usually shared in Davos. It was also shared in January this year in World Economic Forum meetings. The survey shows the pandemic risk, even the epidemic risk, to be very low. That was the perception of the corporate world. And also impact was also seriously underestimated. However, in the report, there was a big and significant warning, which warned the stakeholders to address the risks, not only pandemic, but probably mostly related to climate, etc., which is, similar thing, which I will touch upon later on. So which also emphasized that there's a window of opportunity. There has to be a coordinated multi-stakeholder action to mitigate against these risks among communities and businesses. So this was a very strong warning that came out from that report, which is something that's a serious, it turns out to be a serious homework for all nations and corporations now. So basically the health system risks were underlined and underestimated in the support story. And the governments so far did not pay much of an attention to this risk. Corporations were also caught off guard. Another recent study by Mercer, another Marsh McLennan company, had shown that the companies are also not prepared to deal with corona type of crisis from the business continuity point of view. So actually in the past years, in all the corporations we are involved, we see a detailed sustainability reports that are being written, sometimes a bit detached from the company realities, etc. But basically, this Mercer study had shown that more than half of the companies, 51% to be exact, were not actually prepared for this type of risk. Half of these companies had no plan, the other half had plans in the making. So they were working on it, but basically half of them were caught off guard. So once this crisis is over, we will have a tremendous homework in front of us, not only in front of governments, but also corporations as well. But the point that I want to underline here, that a global coordination and understanding will be needed to combat with this type of risk, or a spillover, or God forbid, for the new ones that we might be facing in the future. So this is where we are today.
Okay. From the health point of view, it's obvious that the preparedness was not there, but there's also the financial markets and the world economy point of view, and the stimulus packages that followed the outset of the pandemic. What do you think about the immediate response? Were the stimulus packages by the US and the European Union timely and enough? I know that they also evolved over time. So what's your assessment on those packages?
Again, I mean, I have to underline that immediate issue that all the governments are related to, of course, health. I mean, the most important thing is to keep people in closed doors, not to have this pandemic spreading further than what it has already done the damage for. But at the same time, I mean, from the supply side, from the demand side, the economies have come to a total shutdown, stop. I mean, this is actually the biggest impact that this pandemic had on the economy. Prior to this pandemic, even at the beginning of the year, when China was experiencing some problems, but the rest of the world were thinking that this would be something that would be contained in China and would not be spilling over. The global growth forecasts were hovering around 2–2.5%. So it was expected to be a good year in terms of the growth, but now pandemic has made it a big game changer. So right now, I mean, the reports that I have seen do show quite sharp decrease in the second quarter and third quarter. So most of the reports do show that we will be ending up the year in a negative territory, probably -2.5% or so. So depending on the lockdown period, depending on how much this will spread, I mean, this can even be worse, but the basic scenario, the base scenario that we are seeing is about 2.5% negative growth. So this is quite significant. In Europe, this is about -5%. In US, a bit less, again, depending on developments. Some markets, it changes from market to market, but globally, there will be a shrinkage. So this is a situation which is worse than 2008 financial crisis. It's much different, but from the economic impact point of view, it is also much worse than 2008 crisis. We are seeing massive unemployment in the US, likely to be followed by other developed economies, and this will be spilling over to emerging markets as well. This is the largest economic decline since 1933. It's a worldwide recession. This is, as I said, worse than financial crisis, and let's hope that this will not lead to a financial crisis. I mean, the governments have taken quite serious measures to prevent that, and I'm my scenario also doesn't foresee this turning into a financial crisis. But basically, just to give you an idea on how the growth is affected, about 40–50% drop in discretionary spending, which is something that we are experiencing now, translates into about 10% drop in GNP, which is something that would have been unimaginable before this crisis. Initial response, so how do those governments respond to this? Initial response, of course, was quantitative easing, as we have seen by US, a program exceeding 2 trillion. Probably we will be seeing significant additions to this, depending on the developments. So despite this, we will probably see US economy shrinking at about 10% in the second quarter. So quantitative easing, supplying money is a prescription that the leading economy, starting with US, is using, but it is not going to cure all the problems. Federal Reserve, had also provided swap lines for emerging countries, Mexico, Brazil, Singapore, and South Korea. Basically, these are companies that Fed had done swapped transactions also in 2008 financial crisis, so they have already an infrastructure. European Union has followed with 750 billion quantitative easing, but there is a problem within European Union how to address especially the hard-hit Italy and Spain. They are working on issuing a new Corona bond to help. Today, I mean, there was a large Zoom meeting, as we are doing now in the European Union. Unfortunately, they have not agreed. So for the first time, for example, also there, we have seen German 10-year bonds and Italy bonds spread expanding to as high as 210 basis points, etc. So there's a problem there, but I'm sure they will be solving those problems. IMF is not staying idle. They are working on a program for short-term dollar loans to countries which may not have US treasuries. They are focusing on countries with strong macroeconomic fundamentals, whoever they are. We can talk a bit about emerging markets later on if you like. But basically, I mean, everybody is doing some homework. What sort of remedy they will be doing. SDRs is another issue which was used in 2008 financial crisis, and G20 members could be also working on. But first, an initial response had been printing money, quantitative easing, then seeing where this will be leading. I think the measures that on the fiscal side will have to follow thereafter. Of course, there are different shapes and sizes of economies that are involved in here. It is not an easy task, but everybody is on alert. The initial response had been just to print money and then wait.
I want to come, when the developed economies, the strong economies are in such dire straits. I mean, we're so worried about emerging markets and also Turkey. So I want to come to kind of our part of the world and to emerging markets. What are the implications for emerging markets in general and Turkey in particular? And can you also elaborate across different asset categories?
Okay, sure. Well, of course, let's look at emerging markets pre-pandemic crisis. I mean, already 2020 had some thorny issues for these countries to deal with, especially the period where the money was abundant and interest rates were low. The emerging markets enjoyed borrowing in the markets, piling up debt. Some have reasonable levels, like Turkey. Some have already problems coming from 2008 that have piled up, which will probably make, I mean, with this crisis, things will be a bit worse. So now, what this crisis will lead, of course, exports have nosedived, economies are shutting down. For a lot of the emerging markets, it will be a difficult period. It's really quite a difficult period. So, for example, in Turkey's case, since you wanted to concentrate on Turkey, which is, I mean, our domain, which we should know better. EU is our biggest partner, not only in trade, but also in foreign direct investment and also financing. And Turkey intrinsically has current account, has not yet invented a more innovative model other than expanding current account and financing growth. Whenever that financing quality improves with FDI, with long-term financing available, the situation is better, we are comfortable. Whenever it's not, we are much dependent on short-term capital, what we call hot money. The financing quality is worsened. So basically, the contraction of EU is not good news for us. So how EU will come out of this crisis, whether it will come as a united and mending the wounds type of EU or disintegrated into, remains to be seen. I mean, it will be an important development for Turkey to watch. Of course, the countries which are going to be worst hit are going to be the ones with too much debt. Actually, for this, as I said, IMF and other multilateral institutions are working on some issues like Corona bonds, etc. But basically, for those countries with sizable, already having existing sizable debt, adding additional debt is not going to be reasonable. So there has to be some grant component for those countries which cannot sustain larger debt. Who will get it, who will not, etc. I mean, that will be an important choices that needs to be made in the coming weeks and months. OECD came up with a report last week which says the potential, which shows the potential impact on the complete shutdown on different economies. Basically, for emerging economies in that report, as far as I have seen, it will have somewhere between 15 to 35% impact. Turkey is somewhere in between. Of course, in Turkey, what would be seriously hurt would be some of the vital sectors that we have, like tourism, like textile, like automotive and spare parts, media communications, especially textile and tourism are important and vital sectors for Turkey, not only from currency earning point of view, but also from employment point of view. So, I mean, initially when the problem was started in China, I mean, there were some speculation whether we would be benefiting from this, but not to forget we are importing also a lot of the raw materials, so there are supply chain issues with China as well. But in any case, I mean, these sectors, starting with tourism, will be definitely hurt. Depending on the length of the crisis, there will be a serious damage. This is not only for Turkey, for all the airline companies, airport operators, all the service sectors will have some suffering. Basically, the Turkish economy has evolved in the past decade more into service economy from manufacturing and agriculture. So we already had some issues with our growth model. So once this crisis is over, once we figure out how to repair the damage, I think much talked about but little done topic of revisiting Turkey's growth model will also be a good idea.
You from emerging markets and from Europe, you brought the topic to Turkey, and you talked about, you know, the potential impact on some of the sectors as well. I wanted to get to the policy side. What kind of policy choices does Turkey have? How do you assess what has been done so far as a response? And in particular, what do you think about the level of economic contraction and what can be done to mitigate it from the policy end?
Okay. From what I have seen, I mean, like similar to the across the globe, all the economies, Turkey has also done some monetary easing, which is indispensable, which will probably need to be extended further. Basically, the most of the focus in Turkey so far have been concentrating on the health issue, where there is a real coordinated action to contain this pandemic. There are also a lot of critics on the approaches, etc. But there is a scientific council which is very seriously and in a delicate manner. Now that they share more details with us, we are seeing that they are really doing a good job to contain this pandemic in a smart, clever fashion. But in any case, I mean, with a complete shutdown or not, most of the economy is shut down anyway. So whether we shut down 90% or 100%, actually at the end of the day, from the impact to economic point of view, will not make much of a difference. So I think the remedy for this, once the extent of the damage is known, we'll have to get some coordination with the multilateral financial institutions. As I said, Turkey, we lack savings, we need external financing. We already have external financing. The reserve levels that we have currently can meet our short-term obligations. But in any case, for the sustainable growth, we need to look at sustainable financing models. There are things positive and working for Turkey, which are our advantages, which are the strong fundamentals. Those are young and dynamic population, which is also in this health crisis helping us in that respect as well. Turkey always has growth appetite, flexible economy. We have been to many crises, so we know how to deal with crisis. Actually, I have seen this in 2008 when I was running a bank jointly with our European friends. I mean, they were quite impressed with the knowledge and know-how that we have in in managing risks in the crisis periods, because they have not seen crisis until 2008. So we have quite a, I don't know, I mean, that's not something to be proud of when you list the number of crises that we have lived through, but the experiences that we can extract from that, I think, is an advantage. And the fiscal situation that Turkey has currently has some room to expand. So our budget deficit, our total debt to GNP, provided that we can we take some measures not to deteriorate it further. B, and we again focus on much talked about structural reform that we have neglected so far in doing, could provide us some flexibility in that regard as well. So there are definitely, I mean, areas for improvement in the economy that we will have to probably now focus more seriously on. But for the short run, what needs to be done to assess the damage, to make sure that the financial system is up and running and liquidity is in place. Then we will have to look at our growth model, definitely. We had to look at it last year, we had to look at it last month, but after the crisis, we definitely have to look at under the new conditions, new normal, to avail sustainable growth. We cannot just go on either with pandemic or without, with large current account deficits and the financing needs that can really make zigzags in our growth. In the new normal, external financing will be hard. The conditions will probably be tough and detailed, but we will have to get prepared for it. We have a lot of advantages that we have to build upon.
Going back to the overall picture, you touched upon some of the sectors that would be impacted in Turkey. What's your prediction for the most affected sectors by the pandemic globally? And also, in particular, emerging market leaders, what should they be focusing on in terms of policies to jumpstart their economy once there is some sort of a normalization in the pandemic stage?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, jumpstarting is the right terminology. Actually, we have not seen global economies totally shutting down and restarting again. So it will be an experience for all. As I mentioned again, I mean, within service sectors, activities involving travel, including tourism, direct contact between consumers and service providers, such as hairdressers, house purchases, are clearly affected, adversely affected by restrictions on the movement and the social distancing. Actually, this social distancing and movement even once this pandemic does not pose an immediate threat, will be important elements in our lives that will continue. So probably travel will be not as easy as before. Service sectors such as restaurants, etc., will be affected. For example, I was hearing the other day that in South Korea, I mean, the restaurants have opened, but you will have to get your temperatures measured before you enter into the restaurant. So there will be on the hygiene side, etc., especially for a country like Turkey, which is where tourism revenues constitute a significant part of the GMP. We will have to be sensitive and utmost, because the travelers will have to be very picky about the hygiene conditions, making sure that they are not going to be affected from urine, etc. So this will be an important thing. Not only we will have to get the hotels and restaurants up and running, we will have to make sure that they are up to the new standards. So unfortunately, most retailers, restaurants, cinemas have been closed. The activity is fully stopped. Construction sector is an important one for Turkey as well. I mean, this is also adversely affected. So we will see some temporary reductions in investment in these sectors. In manufacturing sectors, probably in time, the way that they work, the way that employment is affected, will be something sensitive. Here, supply chain definitely will have to be revisited. This is a cliche that is being used now, but it is more important than ever. Where you are important, who is carrying your goods, how do you reach your customer, etc., will be an important one. So each company, each sector that are vital for Turkish economy will have to evaluate these issues. And unemployment will be an important issue for all. So for Turkey as well, especially already before coming into this crisis, we had significantly high youth unemployment, which is potentially an important social threat. We will not only have to educate properly, train properly the youth for the new jobs that will be available, but also at the same time find jobs for them. So investing in infrastructure will be an important thing. I think a lot of the emerging economies, this will be the place to start. There will be some fiscal expansion whenever available and possible, especially in healthcare, in technology. There will be significant investments that will be made in the coming months, years. I mean, already we are seeing that. I think in Turkey, we were already doing some preparations. We will have to just expedite. A lot of the things that we probably are discussing for sectors to focus on the type of businesses that we should be encouraging, giving subsidies or incentives to, will have to be revisited. The plans will have to be that probably like the things that the investments that we have to make on education and technology will have to be expedited. I mean, the plans are already in place, maybe, but some of those plans that were deemed to be medium-term, short-term plans will have to focus on the short term from here on.
In the interest of time, I'm going to combine my last two questions into one.
Okay. No problem.
The first section has to do with the impact on the financial sector, both in Turkey and globally. Just to get into that a bit more, in addition to the real economy, what should we expect on that front? And lastly, I mean, globalization. Is this the end of globalization, a new beginning for globalization? Some wisdom on that. And then we're going to go to the questions from our audience.
These are two huge questions, which I will try to fit in three minutes, making it impossible. Financial institutions, financial sector is very important. First, we should make sure the already existing sound, well-capitalized, well-managed banking system to function, and the banking sector will have to act responsibly in this crisis. This is not normal times; these are very unusual times. Already, I mean, I know the bank managements are doing their best, but they will probably have to be a bit more flexible. They will have to, they should not lose the customer centricity, those customers centricity, those customers that exist today, which can be in trouble because of losing their jobs or potentially losing their jobs, or companies that are having experiencing cash flow problems, etc. That will be there in a year's time, 2 years' time. So there will have to be a common understanding among financial sector and real sector. But at the same time, we should not deteriorate financial sector so much that it would impair its functioning. I mean, the risk management, the banks, especially the 2001 crisis, had shown in Turkey how we should be capitalizing banks, how we should be running risks, and how the banking sector should be supervised. So there are a lot of good lessons learned. We should not forget those, but we will have to build upon it. So it's not time to demoralize. Already after the last year's currency shock and the economy having up and down, we have had in some sectors some issues regarding non-performing loans. We will have much more non-performing loans. The good management post-crisis does separate these non-performing loans, make sure that the rest of the banking is well capitalized, and find solutions for the problematic assets. So this is a methodology that we will have to use, that we have successfully used in the past. So it requires constant monitoring, early assessment, mitigation plans. But I'm quite confident, not because of my professional deformation, quite confident that the banking sector will handle this, and we have the proper supervision systems in place to handle this. As to your question to globalization, there were levels of globalization which has not produced wealth for all, especially income disparity, even after 2008 crisis, had been a serious issue. This was going to be a problem, so we will have to look into globalization in a different change. But now we are seeing that in the short run, I mean, there could be some issues regarding maintaining own health systems, trying to close the borders. Physically, it has to be done for quarantine purposes anyway. But this crisis had shown us and will show us in a very vivid way that there needs to be a global cooperation, understanding, not only for this pandemic, but a lot of the issues. For example, climate change, which is something that you and I know that Colombia attaches a lot of importance, actually have done quite a lot of restructuring in the academic calendar to do this. It is not something romantic, it is not something long-term, medium-term, it is here to stay. Actually, just like pandemic, this requires a lot of global coordination. So I think globalization will take a different shape and form. It will focus much more on health, equality, environment, more probably so than before. Sometimes when you go through bitter experiences, you understand things better. You try to do your homework in a different fashion, in a more understandable fashion, etc. So I think this is where we are as far as the globalization is concerned. It is here to stay. It will take a different shape and form. I'm quite optimistic. I mean, even though initially there are a lot of speculation that the nationalist sentiment will be riding things, things will get a bit, but I mean, the common sense shows us and tells us, and this pandemic had really shown us in a much more vivid way that we will have to cooperate, work together, and address the issues in totality. Otherwise, these issues, I mean, this even small virus that has emanated from one place, we have been how powerful and it is to impact our lives, our economies, etc. So I think it will be a different shape and form.
Thank you. You've inserted a bit of optimism, I think, into all of our lives this day. So at this point, I want to thank you for this section, and I want to turn it over to my colleague Hannah Onat, who will be reading out the questions that were sent through either email or via the chat box. Hannah?
So Yep, our first question comes from Farooq Bill, and the question is, would a new world economic system be expected in the foreseeable future, like a new Bretton Woods or new paradigms between social utility and corporate welfare, and possibly an oversized role of the entrepreneurial state?
Well, thank you. I mean, it's not an easy question to answer right away. I think we will have to see. First of all, I'm optimistic in believing that the world leaders, especially, I mean, large economies which have more saying in how the economies should be run, how the global, governance should be taking place, will take responsibility and will take lessons from this. As I said, I mean, of course, the damage that will be coming out of this pandemic, or if we make similar mistakes from other issues which needs global coordination, is not going to be symmetric. The issues that emerging economies will face are not going to be on their own, as we have seen with the social movement, with migration, with the issues that we are already dealing with. I mean, it is an issue that is thought to be in the remotest part of the world, is not an issue that is that can stay as an isolated one. So I think there will be a more global responsibility in terms of attacking the issues. Whether this will extend to monetary systems, whether this will just stay at healthcare, environment levels, remains to be seen. I think once the world leaders, the global leaders, developed economies get the taste of what we can achieve by cooperating better rather than acting on our own and dealing with our own issues or just trying to blame each other, once we see the results, I think this optimism will spread to other areas as well. So yes, we will see a better coordination. Also, I mean, from the European Union perspective, I would like to touch upon, even though, I mean, the question was not specifically to the European Union, but also in that perspective, I think there were already issues regarding what sort of European Union was evolving as such. But now, especially with how this type of crisis affected some members of the Union, how strong members will have to assume leadership, how coordination will have to be effective, etc., I think has taught us a lot of really live lessons that we will have to benefit from. So I'm also quite positive in that respect that there will be better coordination. There will be a lot of discussions, there will be a lot of haggling, I mean, bargaining on the table, etc. But at the end of the day, what even the most developed, best managed economies have to lose is what is at stake is quite sizable.
The second question is from Arzu Tekir. Compared to the 2008 crisis, now there is a big brain drain happening in Turkey. What would be its effects on the Turkish economy?
Well, Turkey needs well-educated, capable people to take part in running the economy, be it in private sector or public sector. So I see the diaspora who has opted to work outside Turkey after 2000. Actually, this has happened more in the past 5 years. It has nothing directly related to 2008 crisis, but I mean, in the past decade, we have seen this trend. So this can be, provided that we make the right things, provided that we take the right measures, provided that we do what we have done in the past and worked. I mean, we don't need a new prescription. We know what had worked for Turkey. What we have done in the past, after the crisis, in terms of reshaping our financial systems, in terms of incentivizing private sector, in terms of disciplining public sector, in terms of, doing what we have done in a transparent manner, etc., is the prescription. So if we do these things, we will be reattracting the talent that is not currently in Turkey. Already we have quite a talent in Turkey, so coupling with these, I think we can achieve things much better. So I see this as an asset of Turkey, as an opportunity for Turkey, provided that we do the right thing, we prepare the right infrastructure for a more fertile economy.
The next question comes from Jonathan Wigan. You repeatedly mentioned the necessity for growth model reform within Turkey. Could you expand on this by giving some more detail about the current growth model and how you think it could be changed for the better in light of the current situation and the possible new reality once the peak of the crisis has passed?
Very good question. The current model was not a sustainable model before this crisis. Now it is not a model at all. So we have to create value. We have to have a better education system to create this value, tuned with the strengths that I have mentioned that we have. So we have very young, dynamic population, but we will have to educate and train them for the needs of the future. We have to make more serious investments in technology. I'm not saying that we have not done that, but we actually, we have seen that in a very short time, in a lockdown which the corporations were not prepared for, we have been able to see that a lot of the corporations can work remote. So even though they may not have had, like I mentioned in the beginning, a preparedness plan for this, they have been able to adapt. So that is the infrastructure, flexibility, agility that we have, that is to our advantage. But after the crisis, we will have to focus on our education system, on training in order to create value. What I wanted to emphasize is that creating large current accounts, trying to find financing for it, especially now ever more difficult markets that we will face, is not a model. So the new model will have to focus on sustainability, will have to focus on supply chain in the new environment, will have to focus on value added. So already we were, as I said, a lot of these things we were experiencing the evolution. I'm not saying that we need to make overnight revolution, but we will have to expedite, we will have to speed up this evolution in order to adjust to this new normal and in order to extract more value with our trading partners.
Our next question comes from Ege Duruk. I want to understand why you think external financing will be difficult for Turkey after the pandemic.
It will be difficult for everybody. It will be difficult for everybody. Already, there are tens of countries lined up in front of IMF asking for money. IMF will probably be having a much larger set to deal with. They are aware of it. The financing will have to be provided. The biggest financer will be the developed countries of the world. But once you have so much demand for something and the supply is constrained, the common sense tells me that you will have to have certain advantages, you will have to have certain minimum requirements met. So for those economies which have the transparency, which have the budget discipline, which have the usual prescriptions that this multinational institutions do require, will have to be there, probably in a more strict way. So, the fact that quantitative easing will provide a lot more financing available doesn't mean that it will just pour into emerging markets. It will have to create also employment in developed economies. It will have to go to probably a lot of the infrastructure. We will see a lot of infrastructure investments in the US and Europe in the coming years. So in order to benefit from those, we will have to look into our export capabilities, on our construction capabilities abroad, etc. But the financing will not be as easy as before, even though in the short run, we could be deceived that quantitative easing will have money and money will be available for everybody.
The next question is from Sardar Eren. Can China use this crisis as an opportunity to increase its influence by providing financing in emerging markets and or the EU? Is this a threat or just another resource for debtors?
Very good question by Sardar. Well, I think the way that Chinese handled the crisis, the way that they experienced it first and seems to be getting out of it, shows that China will most likely play a much larger role in the global economy than we were. I mean, already we were seeing this happening. If you look at the global top 10 banks, 5 of them are Chinese. I mean, there are only in the top 10 or 20, I believe there are only 2 American banks. So it's, I mean, the Chinese role in the global financing, global economy had been increasing. The new normal, the new world will probably provide some advantages for further growth for China or speedier recovery for the Chinese economy than the other economies. So yes, but I mean, this is the problem with China is that, I mean, they don't have the reserve currency. So I mean, US, whenever they have problems, Fed can overnight come up and say, we are going to print $2 trillion. We have another 2 in the cupboard. When you are the reserve currency, when you have such a strong economy, that is something. If you don't, that's another thing. So, I mean, how this will change remains to be seen. China may also have ambitions to play a larger role in the financial markets. This is something that could be in the making. Another important factor will be how this trade wars, nationalist sentiment would be growing. I mean, there are a lot of already, I mean, we are seeing that a lot of mudslinging on both sides. I mean, who is doing what, etc. So, in short, I think the role of Chinese in global trade and finance were already taking its toll. It will be higher, but of course, the developed economies like US and Europe, I mean, will not just be handling it as such. So, I think we will have to see what sort of leadership role in the financial markets, in the economy, they will have to play after this pandemic. But the Chinese definitely are big, strong, and their earlier recovery from this is an advantage.
The next question is from Engin Turanlı. On the demand side, what is your view of consumer behavior after COVID-19 is over? Do you expect people will be over-consuming to compensate the time lost? Or could there be a change in consumer habits as people have realized that they can live with much less during this lockdown? And while you're at it, could you please mention again the report that you had mentioned in the beginning? There was a question about what report that was.
Okay. What I mentioned in the beginning was the Global Risk Report by Marsh McLennan, which is shared in World Economic Forum. Basically, it is a survey of the companies which shows how the corporate world is perceiving the risks and the impact. In all companies in risk management, functions, models, basically this is something that they will have to do. So this is an amalgamated version of it. Which is something that's public. So if you enter in Google Marsh McLennan Global Risk Report, you will find it. The question was whether the consumer spending will turn stronger ever or will come slowly. Difficult to see. Especially if we are talking about Turkey, definitely there will be some suppressed demand for spending that will be there. On the supply side, how fast the companies will be on their toes, retailers will be on their toes to up and running, will be a factor, but I'm confident that they are already making plans for the T+1 time to be ready and serving the customers, etc. Probably we will see a short run hiccup in the depressed demand. Then we will see some sort of leveling off in the spending. This crisis must have thought that we cannot live on borrowed time. We cannot just, I mean, on the consumer side, I mean, if you have danger of losing your job, if you have danger of having lesser income in real terms, etc. I mean, this is the time that you will have to adjust your spendings accordingly. So I will think there will be some defensive knee-jerk reaction to that. I don't think that the economy will turn into a big spending economy like we have seen before. I mean, already this crisis must have thought that, especially for those wage earners who have to live month after month, etc., there has to be some precaution taken, etc. So it will also depend on how well our financial system will be able to serve the customers, etc. So in short, in the very short term, I think we will see some spike, but we might very well see in real terms some reduction in consumer spending in the years thereafter. Any more questions?
Hannah?
I think that's it.
Well, in that respect, then we would like to thank you very much, Tayfun Bayazıt, for joining us this evening. And everyone, thank you so much. It's our first webinar, and I hope that it's been as informative for us as it's been for you. Thank you, Tayfun. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a safe evening. Have a healthy week. All the best.
Thank you, Ipek. It was a pleasure for me as well. I hope everybody a safe and healthy future. And this pandemic, I think, is also teaching us to be with ourselves, to think about our lives, to think about our objectives in life, etc. So for me, at least, the past couple of weeks have been. So I think it will extend it for further weeks. So it is a time for thought for everybody. Thank you for letting me speak on these matters. Thank you.